when we move into the more social and political consequences of failure to communicate, it's like that's a microcosm of what goes wrong in a society when it really starts to fall apart. You know, when the individuals within the society who have differing viewpoints can no longer communicate, the whole society shakes and trembles. And you can think about this from a democratic perspective too, because you might say, well, what's the purpose of elections? Well, people who are aligned with a particular ideology think, well, we need to win the election because our viewpoint is right. But then you might ask yourself, well, why are there these other viewpoints? And why do things go so bad when one viewpoint dominates so heavily that everyone who has the other viewpoint, you know, gets shot? That seems like a bad thing. So what exactly is going on in a democratic state? And what's going on is that there's all these different viewpoints, and a lot of them are temperamentally informed. So we know, for example, that liberals are higher in openness and lower in conscientiousness than conservatives. And so the conservatives are conscientious, but they're not very creative and open. So they're good at running things. They're really good at running. They're good at being managers and administrators, for example. But they're not very good at being innovative. The liberals are good at being innovative because they're open, but they're not very conscientious. So like, and they have to be less conscientious in some ways if they're going to be creative, because conscientiousness can constrain creativity. And so for the society to work properly, the people with the liberal temperament and the conservative temperament have to interact with each other, because the liberals think up all the new companies and the conservatives run them. So, and then in the political state per se, it's like conscientiousness is a virtue. Although if it's exaggerated too much, especially the orderly part, then it can become tyranny. And openness is a virtue too, but you don't want every bloody thing changing every second. So there's got to be some constant negotiated peace between order and innovation. And the way that that happens is that the two sides communicate. It isn't that one side wins or the other side wins. It's that the dialogue stays open so that the viewpoints can be represented properly, and so that as the environment moves, because sometimes maybe the environment is such that being conscientious is going to be better, and sometimes it's going to be, the environment has moved so that openness is going to be better, because the environment moves, the conversation has to track those movements so the society stays healthy across time. And the same thing applies in any kind of long-term relationship. It's like you marry someone, now you've got two brains, and they don't work the same. It's like, you want to have two brains, or do you want to have one? That's the first question. You're going to do a lot better with two. So how do you optimize the functioning of the two brains? Well, obviously, they've got to communicate. You know, there's got to be freedom of expression, and there has to be listening. So that's the evaluative tendency, which is, you're wrong, before I even know what you're talking about. At least I should know what the hell you're talking about before I decide if you're wrong. And so back to the poverty issue, it's like, well, what predicts poverty? Well, the sorts of things that the left-winger talks about, that predicts poverty. So do the sorts of things that the right-winger talks about. So if you're really unconscientious, and that makes you makes you the sort of person that will rely on others to do the work, if you're unconscientious, you're much more likely to be poor. And so that's a real social policy problem too, because you have this horrible problem where you have to sort out what's causing the poverty, you know, and who's taking advantage of the attempts to alleviate it, as well as figuring out, so that's more of an individual temperament problem, which is what the conservatives are concerned about, and then you also have to figure out how to address it on a social level, which of course the conservatives don't like to think about. But it's not like either side has nothing to say. There's information in both those perspectives. It's problematic though, because when you put them together, the phenomena becomes paradoxical, and then it's very difficult to come up with a solution. It challenges your cognitive resources. And what the conservative and the liberal want to do is just simplify it down to one explanation. It's sociological, that's the liberal. It's temperamental, that's the conservative. And so then they have one answer to how it can be fixed. We should fix society, that's the liberal. Those people should just get their act together, that's the conservative. It's like, yeah, well, fair enough, except probably the problem is complicated enough so there's more than one solution necessary, since it's not even a problem, right? Poverty is not a problem. Poverty is like 10,000 problems, and some of them aren't even associated with each other. You know, like there's the poverty that's a consequence of alcoholism. That's not the same poverty that's a consequence of, say, very low intelligence. And that's a completely different poverty than the non-conscientious poverty, or the abuse poverty, and there's no reason to assume whatsoever that those should be amenable to the same solution.